The wagon wheel cracked on the last mile into Coyote Bend, Texas, in the spring of 1874, and Mercy Ann Whitfield climbed down into the mud with $22 sewn into her hem and a marriage certificate she had signed 3 weeks earlier for a man she had never met. If you are watching this from your own corner of the world tonight, drop the name of your city in the comments below, and if you want to see how far a woman with nothing but her own 2 hands can go, stay until the very end. Ezra Coop was not at the station to meet her. He sent his hired man, a boy of 15 named Silas Pratt, who looked at her single trunk and said only, "That everything?" She told him it was, and he did not offer to carry it, so she carried it herself, the 4 miles to the Coop place, past fields gone to Johnson grass, and a barn with half its roof caved in from a hailstorm 2 winters back. The advertisement Ezra had placed in the Fort Worth paper had said nothing about a ruined estate. It had said, in 6 careful lines, that he was a widower of 31 years, sober, in need of a wife capable of coop duties and general housekeeping, and willing to correspond with a woman of practical temperament. Mercy had answered because her stepfather's new wife had made it clear there was no place for her at the supper table anymore, not because the land they described sounded like anything worth having. Waco, in the months before she left, had become a house she no longer recognized as her own. Her father had died of consumption when she was 14, leaving behind a small survey business that her mother struggled to keep afloat for 2 more years before remarrying a cotton merchant named Alden Grubbs, a man of narrow opinions who considered his stepdaughter's education an indulgence best forgotten now that she had reached a marriageable age. When Mercy's mother died of a fever in the winter of 1873, the household's fragile tolerance for her presence collapsed entirely, and Grubbs's new wife, a widow named Cordelia with 3 children of her own, made plain within weeks that there was no place at the family table for a stepdaughter with no dowry and no particular use. It was Cordelia herself who first showed Mercy the advertisement from the Fort Worth paper, less out of kindness than out of a plain wish to see the girl settled somewhere else entirely, and Mercy, reading those 6 careful lines about a widower in need of a wife capable of coop duties, understood immediately that whatever waited for her in Coyote Bend could not possibly be worse than what she was leaving behind. She had kept, through all of it, a single small tin box of her father's surveying tools, a compass, a magnifying loupe, and a worn leather notebook filled with his careful sketches of rock formations across 3 counties, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room so that Cordelia's children would not claim or discard them as they had already claimed or discarded so much else that once belonged to her parents. That tin box traveled with her the entire distance to Coyote Bend, tucked inside her single trunk beneath her clothes, and it would go on to sit, for the rest of her life, on a shelf in the Coop kitchen, close enough to reach whenever she needed reminding of exactly where her particular gift had first been given to her, and by whom, a small and constant reminder, sitting quietly on that kitchen shelf year after year, that carried her steadily onward through every uncertain, uphill season that followed, long after she had any real, practical need of its lessons at all. She had written to Ezra 3 times before the marriage was arranged by post, brief and practical letters on both sides, neither of them offering more sentiment than the arrangement strictly required. Ezra's letters described the ranch honestly enough in outline, though he had left out, whether from pride or simple oversight, the full extent of its decline, and Mercy had not pressed him for details she suspected, correctly, he would rather not commit to paper. She packed a single trunk, took the stage from Waco to the rail line and then the rail line as far west as it ran before the final leg by wagon, and told no one in Waco her destination beyond the barest necessity, wanting, for the first time in her adult life, to arrive somewhere as a woman entirely of her own making, rather than a girl defined by a household that had made its indifference to her plain. She found Ezra Coop behind the chicken house, wrist-deep in the carcass of a hen that had died in the night, trying to determine if disease had taken it or a fox had gotten careless. He looked up at her with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been failing slowly for 2 years and has stopped expecting help from any direction. "You're early," he said, which was not true, and she did not correct him. "Chickens are through that gate, 26 left out of 40. Something's been killing them in the night, and I can't find how it's getting in." Mercy set down her trunk in the dooryard, looked at the coop, at the gap beneath the northeast post where the ground had washed out, and said, "That's your hole, not a fox over the fence, under it." Ezra Coop straightened up slowly and looked at her the way a man looks at a fact he had not asked for. "You know chickens?" "I know holes," she said, and picked her trunk back up. The house itself told its own story before he ever spoke a word of explanation. Dishes from a meal 3 days old still sat in the basin. A woman's shawl, faded blue, hung on a peg by the door that no one had touched in what looked like a long while, and Mercy understood without being told that this was the first Mrs. Coop, dead now, though of what she did not yet know. Ezra showed her to a room off the kitchen, small, with a rope bed and a washstand, and said, "This is yours. I sleep in the loft above the barn most nights anyway, keeping an eye on the stock." It was not an insult, she came to understand later, but the plainest kind of honesty. He did not know what a wife was supposed to be to him yet, and he was not going to pretend otherwise on her first evening. Coyote Bend, when she walked into it 3 days later for flour and salt, was a town of one real street, a church with a bell that had cracked and never been replaced, a mercantile run by a man named Otis Frame, and a banker, Cornelius Red, whose office sat at the good end of the street with glass in the windows, while half the other buildings made do with oiled paper. It was Otis Frame who told her, without being asked, that Ezra Coop had married a soft Eastern woman 2 years back, who had lasted one winter and one bad case of pneumonia before the ground took her, and that the Coop place had been going under ever since. Mortgaged twice to Red's bank, the herd sold down from 60 head to 11, and half the county certain the man would lose the land by autumn. "You married into a sinking ship, Mrs. Coop," Frame said, not unkindly, just as a man states weather. Mercy bought her flour and did not argue the point, because arguing cost nothing and proved less, and she had learned long before Coyote Bend that the fastest way to be underestimated by a room was to let it underestimate you first. She lingered a moment longer in the mercantile after paying, taking in the shelves stocked thin compared to what she remembered of Waco's larger stores, the careful economy and how Frame arranged his goods to make a modest stock look fuller than it was. She noticed, too, the ledger book behind his counter, its pages worn soft at the corners from handling, and understood without being told that Frame extended credit generously to families who could not always pay promptly, a practice that spoke well of the man even as it likely strained his own margins thinner than they ought to be. When she asked him, plainly, whether the Coop place's situation was truly as dire as it appeared, Frame considered the question a long moment before answering honestly. "Ezra's a good man, Mrs. Coop. Just been dealt bad cards 2 years running, and grief on top of it makes a man slower to recover than he might be otherwise. Given time and a steady hand, I don't see why the place couldn't come back. Just hasn't had either yet." It was, though Mercy did not say so aloud, the first genuinely hopeful assessment she had heard since arriving, and she carried Frame's words with her, the whole walk back to the ranch, turning them over the way she turned over rock samples, testing them for the particular weight of truth. The bell above the mercantile door rang behind her as she left, and she noticed, glancing back once, that Cornelius Red had emerged from his own office across the street and stood watching her walk, his expression unreadable at that distance but his attention unmistakable, a detail she filed away without yet understanding its full significance, the way her father had taught her to note anything that did not quite fit the surrounding pattern. What no one in Coyote Bend knew, and what Mercy had told no one since leaving her stepfather's house in Waco, was that her own father, before consumption took him when she was 14, had been a land surveyor and amateur assayer who had taught her to read soil, rock, and water the way other girls were taught embroidery. She had spent 4 years of childhood at his elbow, learning to identify clay veins, to test water for alkali, to spot the pale green streak in a creek bed that meant copper, the rust-colored seep that meant iron, and once, memorably, the black grit in a dry wash outside Palo Pinto that had turned out to be coal. Her stepfather had considered this knowledge useless in a daughter and had discouraged her from speaking of it, so she had learned instead to keep it folded away, the way she kept the $22 in her hem, ready but unspent. The first weeks at the Coop place settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned aloud. Mercy fixed the gap beneath the Coop post with a plank and a line of stones before Ezra had finished his coffee the next morning and lost no more hens that week. She turned the kitchen garden, badly overgrown, into rows of beans and squash by the second Sunday, working until the light gave out, and Ezra took to leaving a lamp burning in the kitchen window past dark, though he never said why. Silas Pratt, the hired boy, warmed to her faster than his employer did, mostly because she fed him properly for the first time in 2 years and did not scold him for the mud he tracked in. Ezra don't talk much, Silas told her one afternoon while they mended a fence line together, but he ain't mean, just tired. Been tired since Mrs. Coop the first passed. Mercy asked no follow-up question because she had learned that people told you more when you let a silence sit than when you filled it with your own curiosity. Ezra, for his part, watched her more than he spoke to her, which she came to understand was simply his nature. He watched her string fence wire with attention he had not taught her and could not explain, watched her boil the wash water with a handful of ash lye she mixed herself instead of buying soap from Frame's Mercantile, watched her walk the north pasture one evening with her skirt hem gone dark with creek mud and come back holding a fistful of gravel she would not explain, only saying, "This water's bad for stock past the second bend. There's salt in the ground feeding it." He checked it against 2 head of cattle that had sickened that spring drinking from that stretch, and found she was right, and said nothing about it for 3 more days, turning the fact over the way he turned over everything, slowly, before he finally asked her over supper, "How'd you know that?" "I had a father who taught me to look at ground instead of just walking on it," she said, and offered nothing further, and he did not press her, though something in his face shifted, faint as a change in weather no one else would have caught. By June the 2 of them had fallen into a working partnership that looked, from the outside, almost like a marriage, though neither had touched the other beyond a handshake at the noon meal. She rose before him and had coffee on before he came in from the barn. He mended what she could not lift alone, and never once suggested she stay indoors instead of working the land, which she came to understand was, in Ezra Coop's private accounting, the highest compliment he knew how to pay. The garden came in heavy that summer, more than the 2 of them and Silas could eat, and Mercy began trading squash and beans at Frame's Mercantile for coffee and cloth, a habit that put a little coin in a tin box she kept beneath her bed, coin that was hers alone, the way the $22 had been hers alone, because a woman who had been left behind once did not intend to be caught empty-handed twice. Ezra remained, throughout that first summer, a man Mercy was still learning to read as carefully as she had once learned to read stone. He rose before dawn each day without being asked, and worked until the light failed, a habit she came to understand less as ambition than as a kind of penance, a way of proving to himself, and perhaps to Rebecca's memory, that he had not simply let the ranch die alongside her. He spoke rarely of his own feelings, but Mercy noticed the particular things he did instead of speaking them, riding the extra half-mile into town for a cut of meat he knew she preferred over the tougher one Frame usually set aside for ranch families buying on credit, or splitting extra kindling on cold mornings so she would not have to go out to the woodpile herself before the sun was fully up. She began, that summer, keeping her own private accounting not of money, but of these small gestures, tracking in her own mind the slow accumulation of evidence that the man she had married, sight unseen, was, beneath his silence, decent in the particular way that mattered most to her. decent in his actions rather than merely in his words, which was, after all, the only kind of decency her own father had ever taught her to trust. There were smaller moments that summer that Mercy carried with her long after, moments that built the quiet architecture of trust between herself and Ezra more surely than any single dramatic gesture could have. There was the evening in late June when a sudden hailstorm threatened the garden she had worked so hard to establish, and Ezra, without being asked, spent an hour in driving wind and stinging ice, helping her drape burlap sacking over the young bean rows, working alongside her in a silence that felt, for the first time, like partnership rather than mere proximity. There was the morning she found him mending the porch step that had wobbled since before her arrival, a small repair he had never gotten around to for his first wife, and when she thanked him he only shrugged and said, "Didn't want you turning an ankle," a sentence so plain it took her a full day to recognize it as tenderness. There was, too, the night in early July when Ezra finally spoke of Rebecca directly for the first time, not in grief, but in ordinary remembrance, telling Mercy over supper how his first wife had hated the taste of buttermilk and had once tried, unsuccessfully, to teach herself to play a borrowed fiddle badly enough that the neighbors complained. Mercy listened without jealousy, understanding instinctively that a man who could finally speak lightly of his dead wife was a man beginning, slowly, to make room in his heart for a second life rather than merely enduring the wreckage of his first, and she counted his laughter that evening, brief and rusty as it was, among the most important things that had happened to her since arriving at Coyote Bend. Silas Pratt, too, became something more than hired help across those months, drawn steadily into the rhythm of the household by Mercy's plain kindness. She taught him his letters properly that summer, having noticed he could barely sign his own name, working with him an hour each evening after chores by lamplight at the kitchen table, tracing words in a borrowed primer while Ezra mended tack nearby, listening without comment, though clearly listening all the same. Silas took to the lessons with a hunger that surprised even himself, admitting to Mercy one evening that he had always assumed reading was a thing reserved for town folks and preachers' sons, not for a boy who mucked stalls for his keep, and Mercy told him plainly that she intended to see him prove that assumption wrong before the year was out, a promise she made good on by autumn, when he read aloud, haltingly but completely, his first full page from the county newspaper. It was Cornelius Redd, the banker, who first made himself known to Mercy directly, riding out to the Coop place on a Tuesday in July under the excuse of collecting a note payment, though the note was not due until September. He was a compact man of perhaps 50, with a way of smiling that never reached above his mouth, and he looked over the mended coop, the thriving garden, and the newly stacked hay with an interest that had nothing to do with pleasantries. "Ezra's improved some since you came," Red said, sitting his horse just outside the yard fence, not troubling to dismount. "Shame it likely won't be enough. This place has been under water at my bank 2 years running. I'd hate to see a fine young woman lose her home before she's had the chance to settle into it." Mercy thanked him for his concern and said nothing else, but she noted, the way her father had taught her to note the color of a creek bed, that Red's eyes had gone to the north pasture twice while he spoke, lingering there longer than idle conversation required, and that his horse had been ridden hard for a man claiming to be merely passing through. She mentioned the visit to Ezra that evening, offering only the facts without embellishment, as was her habit, and Ezra's response told her a good deal about the true state of the ranch's finances that his own reticence had until then kept from her. "Note's not due till September," he confirmed, "but Red's called on me early before, when he wanted something. Never quite says what, though." Mercy asked what the note actually covered, and Ezra, somewhat reluctantly, laid out the full shape of the debt for the first time since her arrival. 2 mortgages taken out in the 2 years since Rebecca's death, one to cover a bad drought year and a second, smaller one, to replace stock lost to the same hailstorm that had caved in half the barn roof, totaling a sum considerably larger than Mercy had guessed from the ranch's outward appearance. She did not flinch at the figure, only asked practical questions about payment schedules and interest, and Ezra, watching her receive the news with the same steady calm she brought to everything, found himself, not for the first time that summer, quietly grateful he had placed that advertisement in the Fort Worth paper. The second antagonist made herself known that same week, in the person of Delphine Ashcroft, who ran the millinery next to Frame's store and considered herself the keeper of Coyote Ben's moral ledger. "You'll want to be careful, Mrs. Coop," Delphine said, pinning a bonnet ribbon while Mercy waited to pay for thread. "Marrying a man so soon after correspondence, and him still not over his first wife, from what I hear. People do talk." Mercy asked evenly what people were saying, and Delphine's mouth pursed with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting to be asked. "Only that it's peculiar. A girl coming from nowhere with no family to speak for her, landing herself a husband and a homestead in one stroke. Peculiar is all." Mercy paid for her thread, thanked Delphine for the ribbon sample, and walked out without raising her voice, though she noted the woman's particular hunger for suspicion the way she noted weather that might turn to hail. Not dangerous yet, but worth watching. The third shadow arrived by letter in early August, forwarded from her stepfather's address in Waco with 3 weeks' delay, and it was this letter that unsettled Mercy more than Red's visit or Delphine's gossip combined. It came from a man named Thaddeus Vane, a merchant her stepfather had once tried to arrange a match with 2 years prior, before Mercy had refused him outright and left Waco rather than be pressed further. Vane wrote that he had learned of her marriage, that he did not consider a hasty arrangement with a failing rancher binding in any way that mattered, and that he intended to come to Coyote Bend himself before the year was out to, in his words, settle what was left unsettled between them. Mercy read the letter twice at the kitchen table by lamplight, folded it small, and did not show it to Ezra, not from any wish to deceive him, but because she had not yet decided what, if anything, there was to be done about a man 300 miles away who believed a refusal could simply be outlasted. She thought often, in the days after that letter arrived, of the last conversation she'd had with Vane in Waco, nearly 2 years prior, in her stepfather's front parlor, where he had laid out his proposal with the same confident presumption evident in his letter now, speaking of the arrangement as a settled matter rather than a question she might answer either way. She had told him then, plainly, that she did not wish to marry him, and he had responded not with disappointment, but with a kind of amused patience, as though her refusal were merely a delay to be waited out rather than a decision to be respected. An attitude that had unsettled her enough at the time that she had begun, within months, seriously considering any path out of her stepfather's household that did not run through Thaddeus Vane. That the same patient presumption had followed her all the way to Coyote Bend, 2 years and 300 miles later, told her plainly that whatever else had changed in her life since Waco, Vane's fundamental character had not. Ezra, for his part, had his own antagonist, one who required no letter or long ride to make himself felt. His late wife's brother, a man named Harlan Doyle, who farmed 20 miles east and had never forgiven Ezra for what he considered a failure to properly grieve his sister before bringing a new woman into her house. Harlan rode over uninvited in mid-August, refused Mercy's offer of coffee with a flatness that bordered on insult, and told Ezra plainly, within Mercy's hearing, that he thought it shameful how quick the house had filled again, as though Rebecca Coop's memory were a debt paid off cheap. Ezra's jaw had tightened, but he said only, "Rebecca's buried proper and mourned proper, Harlan, and nothing about this woman changes that," and Harlan had ridden off without another word, though not before casting a long look at Mercy that told her plainly this would not be the last of it. Mercy learned more of Harlan's history from Silas over the following weeks than Ezra himself ever volunteered directly, piecing together that Harlan and Rebecca had been unusually close as siblings, orphaned young themselves and raised largely by an aunt in East Texas, and that Harlan had moved to be near his sister when she married Ezra, building his own farm within riding distance specifically so the two families could remain close. Rebecca's death, coming as it did within 2 years of that move, had left Harlan not only grieving, but questioning the entire choice that had uprooted his own life, and Mercy came to understand, without ever excusing his rudeness, that his hostility toward her arrival carried the particular sharpness of a man who felt his sister's memory was the only thing he had left of a decision he could no longer undo. Autumn came on hard and early that year, the first frost arriving a full 3 weeks ahead of what the almanac promised, and it was in the scramble to bring in the last of the garden and put up preserves that Mercy first showed Ezra the full measure of what she could do, though she did it in the smallest possible way, as was her habit. She noticed, walking the fence line with Silas one gray morning, a seam of reddish rock exposed where a recent washout had cut a new gully through the northeast corner of the property, the same corner where Cornelius Red's gaze had lingered back in July. She said nothing to Silas, only pocketed a fist-sized piece of the rock and carried it back to the house, turning it over that night by lamplight the way her father used to turn over samples at their own kitchen table years before, testing its weight, its color, the faint metallic streak running through its grain. The memory that surfaced, turning that stone over in the lamplight, was one she had not let herself dwell on in years. Her father's small office in Waco, its shelves lined with labeled samples from a dozen counties, the particular way he would hold a piece of rock up to the window light and turn it slowly, explaining to her, as though she were already the apprentice he clearly wished for, rather than merely a daughter he happened to love, how color banding formed, how weight told you more than color ever could, how the very best samples felt almost cool and dense in the palm compared to ordinary stone. She had been 9 years old the first time he let her identify a specimen correctly on her own, a chunk of galena from a creek near Weatherford, and she remembered still the particular warmth of his pride, brief and unrepeatable once he died 5 years later, a warmth she had spent the better part of a decade without, until this cold October night at a stranger's kitchen table, turning a stone in lamplight exactly as he had taught her, felt for a moment as though he were standing at her shoulder again. She did not sleep well that night, turning the possibilities over as carefully as she had turned the stone itself, weighing what it might mean if she was right, and, more soberly, what it would cost everyone involved if she was wrong, and raised a hope that came to nothing. She decided, before dawn, that she would say nothing to Ezra until she had gathered a second sample from deeper in the gully, wanting more certainty before she risked disturbing the fragile, hard-won stability the two of them had built across that first summer and autumn together. Cornelius Red returned in September, this time with paperwork, informing Ezra that the bank's patience had limits and that the note, though not yet due, would need a partial payment against principal by December, or Red would be forced to consider other arrangements for the property. He said this with the same closed smile he had worn in July, and again his eyes drifted to the northeast pasture before he took his leave, a habit Mercy had now noted 3 times and no longer believed was accidental. That evening she asked Ezra, plainly, whether he had ever had the north corner of the land surveyed for anything beyond grazing, and he told her no man had bothered, since the ground there had always run too rocky to plow and too poor even for good grass. Mercy did not tell him what she suspected. She had learned as a girl that a hunch spoken too early invited doubt, and doubt, once planted, was harder to root out than the truth it was meant to protect. Delphine Ashcroft's gossip found new fuel that same month when word reached Coyote Bend, by way of a traveling drummer who had come through Waco, that Mercy Whitfield had left her stepfather's house under circumstances nobody in town could quite pin down, and Delphine wasted no time embroidering the gap with her own suspicions, suggesting to anyone who would listen at the Mercantile that there might be a reason a young woman would leave family behind for a stranger's advertisement, and that reasons like that were rarely flattering. Mercy heard of it second-hand from Silas, who had overheard it and repeated it to her with the guileless honesty of a boy who did not yet understand how much such words could cost a woman standing in a small town. She thanked him for telling her and resolved to say nothing to Delphine directly, choosing instead to let her work speak where her words could not. The preserves she brought to the church social that October, jars of pickled beans and apple butter set out beside far thinner offerings from women who had never left the county, said more about her character than any denial could have. The church social itself proved a small turning point in how Coyote Bend saw her, though nothing about it announced itself as dramatic in the moment. Mercy arrived with 3 jars of pickled green beans and 2 of apple butter, made from apples bought cheap off a peddler's wagon rather than grown herself, since her own orchard was still years away from existing, and set them on the long table alongside offerings from women who had lived in the county their entire lives. Louisa Kemp, whom Mercy barely knew at the time, tried the apple butter first out of simple curiosity, and her surprised compliment, spoken loud enough for several other women to hear, drew a small crowd around Mercy's contribution that afternoon, women tasting and asking, with genuine curiosity rather than suspicion, where she had learned to balance spice and sweetness so precisely. Mercy answered plainly that her mother had taught her before she died, a detail that softened several faces that had, until that moment, regarded her with the same wary reserve Delphine's gossip had encouraged. It was a small thing, a jar of preserves and an honest answer about a dead mother, but Mercy understood even then that small things, accumulated patiently over months, built a reputation far more durable than any single dramatic gesture could. She left the social that afternoon with 2 new acquaintances, Louisa Kemp among them, and a quieter, more private satisfaction that she had begun, however slowly, to be known in Coyote Bend, not as the stranger who had married a failing rancher, but simply as Mercy Coop, a woman whose preserves were worth asking after. Thaddeus Vane's second letter arrived in October, shorter and colder than the first, stating simply that he would be traveling west before the new year, and intended to call on her personally, as a matter owed to me by both courtesy and prior understanding. This time Mercy did not fold the letter away unread by Ezra. She set it on the table before him after supper, watched him read it twice, and told him plainly who Thaddeus Vane was, and why he believed he had some claim on her still. Ezra read the letter a third time, set it down, and said only, "He's got no claim here. Man doesn't get a woman by insisting hard enough." It was the first time he had spoken of her as unquestionably his, not out of romance, but out of the same flat practicality with which he spoke of fence lines and cattle counts, and something in Mercy loosened at hearing it, some tension she had not admitted to carrying since Waco. Harlan Doyle's second visit came without warning in late October, and this time he brought with him a grievance sharper than grief. Word had reached him, likely by way of Red himself, that the Coop place was behind on its note, and Harlan seized on it as proof of what he had suspected all along, that Ezra's judgment had failed him the day he answered that advertisement. "You'll lose Rebecca's land to the bank with this one at your side," Harlan said, loud enough to carry to the kitchen window where Mercy stood shelling beans, "same as you're losing everything else." Ezra told him, with more heat than Mercy had yet heard from him, to get off the property and not return until he could speak of her with respect, and Harlan left in a fury that Mercy understood was not truly about her at all, but about a grief Harlan had never allowed himself to finish grieving. November brought the first hard freeze, and with it a decision Mercy had been turning over since September. She waited until a Sunday evening, when Silas had gone to his own family's place for the day and the house was quiet, and she set the reddish stone from the northeast gully on the table between herself and Ezra, along with a second, smaller sample she had gathered more recently from deeper in the same gully. "I want to show you something," she said, "and I want you to hear the whole of it before you say anything." She told him then, plainly and without embellishment, about her father the surveyor, about the years at his elbow learning to read stone and water, about the streak of color in the rock that she believed, though she was not yet certain, marked a vein of silver-bearing ore running beneath the very corner of land that Cornelius Red could not stop looking at. Ezra turned the stone over in his hands for a long while, saying nothing, and when he finally spoke it was not disbelief but something quieter. "You've known this since September." "I suspected it since September," she corrected. "I didn't want to hand you a false hope and watch you spend money we don't have chasing it." He looked at her then with the particular attention of a man reassessing everything he thought he understood about his own household, and said, "Show me the gully." Before that walk, though, Ezra asked one further question, quieter than the others, that Mercy had been half expecting since she first decided to tell him. Why show me now, and not before? She considered her answer carefully before giving it, wanting to be as honest with him as she was asking him to be honest in return. "Because I've watched you long enough now to know you'd rather have a hard truth plainly than a comfortable guess dressed up as certainty," she said. "And because I trust you not to spend money we don't have chasing a hope that might come to nothing. I couldn't have said that in June. I can say it now." Ezra sat with that answer a long moment, then nodded once, the particular economical gesture she had come to recognize as his version of a much longer speech, and said only, "Then we'll go careful. Sample first. No talk of it beyond this house until we know for certain." It was, Mercy reflected later, the exact shape of caution her own father would have counseled, and she took it as further proof that whatever else separated them, she and Ezra Coop approached the world with the same fundamental instinct: look closely before you leap, and never mistake hope for evidence. They walked the northeast corner together the next morning, Mercy pointing out what her father had taught her to see: the color banding in the exposed rock face, the particular weight of the stone in her palm, the faint crumbling texture that differed from ordinary caliche. She was careful, even then, to tell him she was no assayer and could not swear to what lay beneath without proper testing, but she believed it worth the risk of a single sample sent to a mining office in Fort Worth, and she had already, without telling him, set aside enough from her egg and vegetable money to cover the cost of the assay and the postage both. Ezra did not argue with her plan, though she watched him absorb, in that moment, the fact that his wife had been quietly building a resource of her own beneath his roof for months, unasked and unremarked, and that she had done it not to conceal anything from him, but because she had learned, long before she ever met him, that a woman's readiness was safest kept private until it was needed. Cornelius Redd's third visit, in the last week of November, was the one that turned suspicion into near certainty for Mercy. He arrived this time with an offer rather than a demand, a proposal that the bank forgive a full third of the outstanding note in exchange for a deed transfer of the northeast 40 acres alone, the rockiest and, in his words, least useful parcel of the property. Ezra, who did not yet know what Mercy had shown him meant with any certainty, was inclined to consider it, since a third of the debt forgiven for land he had always thought worthless seemed a fair trade on its face. It was Mercy who asked, quietly, why a banker so anxious about an overdue note would offer to forgive part of it in exchange for the one parcel he had ridden out to study 3 times running. Redd's smile thinned considerably at the question, and he left without an answer, but the visit confirmed for both of them that whatever lay beneath that ground, Redd suspected it too, and had likely known or guessed since before Mercy ever arrived at Coyote Bend. The truth of that suspicion, which Mercy pieced together only gradually over the following weeks, through careful questions to Otis Frame and to Julius Ferris once he arrived on the scene, was that Redd had commissioned a quiet geological survey of the county's ranch lands nearly 3 years earlier, shortly after the first Mrs. Coop's death, using a traveling assayer passing through under the pretense of prospecting for a Fort Worth mining concern. That survey, buried in Redd's private files and never shared with the ranchers whose land it covered, had flagged the Coop property's northeast corner as geologically promising, information Redd had sat on for years, waiting patiently for Ezra's mounting debt to force a foreclosure that would deliver the land into the bank's hands without any need to pay a fair price for what lay beneath it. Mercy's arrival, and the stubborn recovery of the ranch that followed under her management, had very nearly upended 2 years of Redd's patient waiting, and it was this, more than any personal animosity toward Mercy herself, that explained the particular intensity of his interest in the northeast pasture from his very first visit. Frame. Once he understood the fuller shape of what Red had been quietly engineering, told Mercy plainly that he had always found something unsettling about how eagerly Red extended credit to ranchers he seemed to expect would eventually fail, a pattern Frame had noticed across a decade of watching the banker's dealings, but had never before had cause or evidence enough to name aloud. It was this conversation, more than any other single piece of information, that hardened Mercy's resolve to see the ranch's debt settled entirely outside Red's bank, since she understood by then that continuing to owe him anything at all left the Coop family vulnerable to a patience that had already proven itself capable of waiting years for an opportunity. Thaddeus Vane's arrival came earlier than his letter had promised, in the first week of December, riding into Coyote Bend on the same stagecoach that carried the mail, and he did not go first to the Coop place but to Delphine Ashcroft's millinery, where he introduced himself as an old family friend concerned for Mercy's welfare, a framing Delphine received with open delight since it gave fresh and respectable shape to months of idle suspicion. By the time Vane rode out to the ranch 2 days later, half of Coyote Bend had already heard, through Delphine's telling, that a gentleman from Waco had come west, specifically to check on Mrs. Coop, and the whisper that there was more to her hurried marriage than met the eye had hardened, in the space of 2 days, into something closer to accepted fact. Thaddeus Vane rode into the Coop yard on a bay gelding too fine for the mud he crossed to reach it, dressed in a manner that made plain he still thought of himself as a man of means, though Mercy had known even in Waco that half his fortune was owed rather than owned. He did not dismount at first, looking instead at the mended coop, the frost-killed but well-tended garden beds, the neat stack of firewood Silas had split that week, with the same appraising eye Red had used on the northeast pasture, as though tallying what a life here might be worth to a man willing to take it over. "You look well, Mercy," he said, "better than a ranch wife has any right to look, from what I hear of this place's fortunes." Ezra came out from the barn at the sound of the horse and stood beside her without a word, and Vane's eyes moved between them with open calculation. "I've come to speak with you plainly," Vane went on, "and I'd prefer to do it without an audience." Mercy told him, evenly, that Ezra was her husband and would hear anything Vane had to say to her, and Vane's mouth tightened at the correction. What followed was not the dramatic confrontation Delphine's gossip had primed the town to expect, but something colder and more precise. Vane informed Mercy that he had, in fact, come to offer her a way out, that he would settle a sum with Ezra Coop to release her from what he called an arrangement of convenience, and that he would take her back to Waco as his wife within the month, restoring her to a standing she had, in his telling, foolishly abandoned. Mercy let him finish entirely before she answered, because she had learned that a man who believed himself unheard would always overplay his hand, and Vane, sure of his own persuasiveness, had done exactly that, laying out in careful detail his belief that her marriage to Ezra was a transaction he could simply outbid. "I signed no contract with you, Mr. Vane," she said finally, "not 2 years ago in Waco and not since. I chose this marriage freely, and I intend to remain in it just as freely. You've ridden 300 miles to make an offer nobody asked you to make." Vane's composure cracked only slightly, but Mercy saw it, the same flash of entitlement she had seen in him 2 years before when she first refused his suit, and he left the yard with a warning rather than a farewell, telling her that a woman without family behind her would find, sooner or later, that a husband's protection was thinner than she believed. The history between Mercy and Thaddeus Vane ran deeper than the brief mention she had made to Ezra suggested. Vane had courted her, or rather negotiated for her, through her stepfather 2 years before her arrival at Coyote Bend, a match Alden Grubbs had encouraged eagerly since Vane's mercantile connections promised to benefit Grubbs's own cotton trading, and Mercy had refused the arrangement not out of any dramatic objection to Vane's character alone, though she found him vain and calculating, but out of a plain refusal to be traded like inventory between two men discussing her future without once asking her opinion of it. The refusal had cost her dearly in her stepfather's household, deepening the resentment that eventually drove her toward the Fort Worth advertisement altogether, and she had not expected, in all the months since leaving Waco, that Vane's wounded pride would follow her 300 miles west. Ezra, once Vane had ridden off, asked Mercy plainly whether she had ever cared for the man at all, a question asked without jealousy but with the same careful attention he brought to reading soil or stock. Mercy told him the truth without softening it, that she had felt nothing for Vane beyond a cold, practical assessment of his character, that her refusal had been about her own right to choose rather than any preference for someone else, and that meeting Ezra, whatever the arrangement's practical origins, had shown her for the first time what a marriage built on mutual respect rather than transaction might actually feel like. Ezra said nothing in response beyond a short nod, but Mercy noticed he stood a little differently after that conversation. Some old uncertainty about his own worth in the marriage finally settled. Vane did not leave the county immediately after that first visit, lingering instead in Coyote Bend for nearly 2 weeks, taking a room above the Mercantile and cultivating, through careful and patient conversation, a friendship with Delphine Ashcroft that served his purposes considerably better than any direct approach to Mercy had. He fed Delphine details, some true and many carefully embellished, about Mercy's departure from Waco, framing himself as a wronged suitor rather than a man attempting to reclaim a woman who had refused him twice now, and it was this campaign, more than his initial confrontation in the yard, that Mercy came to recognize as his true strategy. Not to win her back directly, but to make her position in Coyote Bend so socially precarious that Ezra himself might eventually be persuaded the marriage had been a mistake. The strategy came to its end not through any dramatic confrontation, but through Ezra's own quiet action, taken without consulting Mercy beforehand, in a manner uncharacteristic enough of his usual careful deliberation that she understood, when she learned of it, exactly how deeply Vane's campaign had unsettled him. Ezra rode into town one afternoon in late December, found Vane at the Mercantile in conversation with Delphine, and told him plainly, in front of witnesses, that he was welcome to stay in Coyote Bend as long as he cared to pay for his room, but that if he spoke Mercy's name to another soul in this county again, Ezra would consider it a personal insult requiring a personal answer. It was the closest Ezra ever came, in all his years, to threatening violence, and though he never raised a hand to anyone in Coyote Bend before or since, the plain, unhurried certainty in his voice was enough that Vane took the stage out of the county 3 days later and never returned. Delphine, who had witnessed the exchange firsthand, found her enthusiasm for Vane's version of events considerably dampened by the sight of a husband defending his wife with such unshakable conviction, and her gossip about Mercy's supposedly murky past quieted noticeably in the weeks that followed. The assay results from Fort Worth arrived by post the same week as the year's harshest cold snap, and Mercy read the letter twice at the kitchen table before she trusted herself to speak it aloud to Ezra. The sample from the northeast gully carried a confirmed vein of silver ore, modest by the standards of the great strikes further west, but substantial enough, the assayer's letter noted, to warrant serious mining interest, and likely worth considerably more than the entire remaining debt on the Coop property combined. Ezra sat with the letter a long while, the way he sat with most things, turning it over before he spoke, and when he finally looked at her, it was with an expression Mercy had not seen from him before, something closer to reverence than surprise. "You knew this might be here since before the frost," he said, "and you never once asked me for anything in return for finding it." "I didn't marry you for a stake in silver, Ezra," she said. "I married you because the advertisement was honest about needing help, and I had none to give elsewhere. Whatever's under that ground belongs to this place, same as I do now." Cornelius. Between the assay results arriving and Red's final offer, there passed nearly a week of uneasy waiting in which Mercy found herself, for the first time since Waco, genuinely afraid, not of poverty, which she had faced before and knew how to endure, but of losing something she had only just begun to let herself want. She confided as much to Ezra one night by the stove, admitting that she had spent the better part of 2 years guarding herself against exactly this kind of hope, since hope disappointed cut deeper than hope never risked at all. Ezra listened, then told her something she turned over in her mind for the rest of her life, that he had watched her mend, plant, and build steadily since the day she arrived, never once waiting for permission or reassurance before doing what needed doing, and that a woman who worked like that did not need him to promise her the outcome would be good. She had already proven, a dozen times over, that she knew how to make good outcomes herself, with or without a promise attached. Delphine Ashcroft, for her part, found herself increasingly isolated in her suspicions as that autumn wore on, since the very drummer who had first carried word of Mercy's departure from Waco returned through Coyote Bend in November with a fuller account, having by then spoken with acquaintances in Waco who confirmed only that Mercy's stepfather had remarried and that the household had grown crowded and unwelcoming, nothing more scandalous than the ordinary unkindness of blended families. Delphine, confronted with this thinner and less interesting truth, did not apologize outright, but she did quiet her commentary considerably, contenting herself instead with vague remarks about how some stories turn out plainer than folks expect, which Mercy understood, correctly, as the closest thing to a retraction Delphine Ashcroft's pride would permit. Red's true intentions became fully visible within days, once word reached him, likely through a clerk at the same Fort Worth assay office he had his own dealings with, that the Coop land had returned promising results. He wrote out a final time in mid-December, no longer bothering with the pretense of concern for an overdue note, and offered instead to buy the northeast 40 acres outright, and then, when Ezra refused, to forgive the entire remaining debt on the property in exchange for a half share of any mineral rights extracted from it going forward. It was Mercy who recognized the offer for what it was, an attempt to seize, through a debt Red himself had allowed to balloon for 2 years past what any prudent banker should have tolerated, a claim on wealth that rightfully belonged to the Coops alone. She proposed, instead, that Ezra pay the note in full using a small advance against the ore's assayed value, secured through a mining broker in Fort Worth rather than through Red's bank at all, cutting the banker out of any claim beyond the debt he was legally owed. Red's composure finally broke at this, and he told Ezra plainly, in front of Mercy, that he had never expected a rancher's wife to outmaneuver him at his own trade, a remark he clearly intended as an insult and which Mercy received, quietly, as the finest compliment Coyote Bend had yet paid her. The final confrontation with Red unfolded over nearly 2 hours at the kitchen table, longer and more detailed than any of his previous visits, since he had come this time with a lawyer from Fort Worth in tow, a thin, nervous man named Whitcomb who seemed considerably less comfortable with the proceedings than Red himself. Red laid out his proposal methodically, producing documents that showed, in careful figures, exactly how much the Coops currently owed and exactly how favorable, on paper, his offer of debt forgiveness in exchange for mineral rights appeared beside the alternative of paying the note outright. Mercy let him finish his entire presentation without interruption, exactly as she had let Thaddeus Vane finish his in the yard months before, and then asked a single question that unsettled the lawyer visibly, whether Mr. Red could produce the original loan documents showing the note's interest terms as originally agreed, since her own review of the ranch's records suggested the rate had been quietly adjusted upward twice over the preceding 2 years, without either renegotiation or Ezra's clear knowledge. Whitcomb shuffled through his papers with growing unease, unable to produce the original terms on the spot, and Red's insistence that the adjustments had been standard banking practice rang thin even to his own lawyer's ears. Mercy pressed further, noting that Texas banking statute required written notice of any interest rate adjustment on an existing note, notice which Ezra had never received, a fact she had confirmed the previous week through a discreet letter to a county clerk in Fort Worth whom Julius Ferris had recommended as trustworthy. Red, cornered by his own paperwork and by a woman he had spent nearly a year underestimating, finally admitted the adjustments had not been properly documented, a concession that gave Ezra and Mercy considerable leverage in the final settlement. Full repayment of the note at its original undoctored rate, with the mining advance from Ferris covering the balance comfortably and leaving considerable surplus besides, and no share of mineral rights extended to Red's bank whatsoever. It was in the walk Red took back to his horse that afternoon, defeated and visibly diminished, that he made the remark about being outmaneuvered by a rancher's wife, intending it as a parting insult, unaware that Mercy would carry it forward for the rest of her life as one of the truest compliments she ever received, proof that the years of careful reading and quiet observation her father had taught her had, in the moment that mattered most, been sharper than a trained banker's own trade. The mining broker Mercy contacted in Fort Worth a measured man named Julius Ferris, who had spent 20 years buying and selling claims across the Texas frontier, arrived at the Coop place in January to inspect the gully himself before advancing any sum against it, and he brought with him 2 assistants and a wagon of testing equipment that drew half of Coyote Bend out to the road to watch it pass. Ferris confirmed within 3 days what the Fort Worth assay had already suggested, and offered Ezra and Mercy jointly a development advance considerably larger than either of them had dared to hope, structured so that the Coop family would retain 3/4 ownership of any future yield, while Ferris's company handled the cost and labor of proper extraction. It was Mercy who negotiated the final terms, sitting at the same kitchen table where she had once shown Ezra a stone by lamplight, insisting on clauses that protected the grazing land from being torn up beyond what mining required and that guaranteed local hiring wherever possible, a condition Ferris found unusual in a rancher's wife, but readily agreed to, since the terms cost him nothing he had not already intended to spend. The negotiation itself took the better part of 3 days, spread across 2 visits, and Mercy insisted on being present for every hour of it, seated at the kitchen table with her own ledger open beside Ferris's contracts, cross-checking every figure he proposed against her own careful arithmetic. Ferris, who had spent 2 decades dealing with ranchers eager to sign whatever a mining company put in front of them out of sheer desperation for cash, found himself genuinely startled by her insistence on reading every clause aloud before either she or Ezra would put pen to paper, and more startled still when she caught an error in the second draft of the contract that would have quietly reduced the Coop's share of future yield from 3/4 to 2/3 after the first 5 years, an error Ferris claimed was a clerical oversight, but which Mercy suspected, though she never said so aloud, had been no accident at all. "You'll want to correct that," she told him, sliding the page back across the table, "before either of us signs anything." Ferris corrected it without argument, and told Ezra afterward, out of Mercy's hearing, that he had rarely negotiated with anyone, man or woman, banker or rancher, who read a contract as carefully as his wife did. The clause protecting the grazing land had come from a specific memory Mercy carried from her girlhood, a story her father had told her once of a Colorado family whose entire pasture land had been torn apart by careless mining operations that left the ground unusable for a generation afterward. The mineral wealth extracted, but the family's actual livelihood, the cattle and grass that had sustained them for decades before any ore was ever found, destroyed in the process. She would not let the same mistake happen to the Coop ranch, she told Ezra plainly, because silver came and silver eventually ran out, but land, tended properly, could feed a family forever, and she did not intend to trade a lasting inheritance for a temporary windfall. Ezra told her, listening to this, that she thought further ahead than any man he had ever done business with in the county, Red included, and meant it as the plainest compliment he knew how to give. With the note to Red's bank paid in full by February, and a modest but real income beginning to flow from the mine's first months of careful extraction, Ezra and Mercy faced a question neither of them had allowed themselves to consider seriously before: what to build with land and money that had, only a year earlier, seemed destined to be lost entirely. It was Mercy who raised it first, one evening in early spring, saying she did not want the silver to simply vanish into fences and cattle the way money so often did on a ranch, that she wanted it to become something that would still be standing long after both of them were gone. Ezra, who had spent 2 years believing his only task was survival, found himself for the first time imagining a future rather than merely enduring toward one, and he told her, with the same flat honesty he brought to everything, that he trusted her judgment on what that something ought to be more than his own. What Mercy proposed, over the course of that spring, was a schoolhouse for Coyote Bend, the nearest existing school being 9 miles distant in the county seat and unreachable for half the year once the creeks rose, meaning most of the children on the surrounding ranches, including several of Silas Pratt's younger siblings, had never learned more than their letters. She proposed further that the schoolhouse include, alongside its ordinary lessons, instruction in the practical reading of land and water that her own father had taught her, believing that the next drought or the next bad well need not catch the next generation as unprepared as her own neighbors so often were. Ezra listened to the full plan without interrupting, then said only, "Rebecca always wanted a school built here, never had the money for it." It was the first time he had spoken his first wife's name to Mercy without grief edging into it, and Mercy understood it for the gift it was, not an erasure of what had come before her, but an invitation to carry it forward. That same evening, Ezra told her more of Rebecca than he ever had before, sitting at the kitchen table long after the dishes were cleared, describing how his first wife had come from a Georgia school-teaching family and had always felt the lack of proper education among the ranch children keenly, having taught a handful of them their letters herself in the front room of this very house during the 2 winters before her death, informally and without pay, simply because she could not bear to watch children grow up unable to read a Bible or a bill of sale. Mercy listened to all of it without interruption, understanding that Ezra needed to say it as much as she needed to hear it, and when he finished, she told him that she intended the schoolhouse to bear, somewhere on its cornerstone, a small plaque naming Rebecca Coop as the one who first dreamed of it, so that the building would carry both their memories forward together rather than replacing one woman's wish with another's accomplishment. Ezra did not answer in words. He reached across the table and took her hand, the first time he had done so since their wedding day, and held it a long moment before either of them spoke again. The plan required more capital than the initial silver advance alone could comfortably provide without threatening the ranch's own working funds, and Mercy spent several evenings in March working through the figures with a thoroughness that made even Ezra, by then well accustomed to her competence, remark that she ought to have been a banker herself rather than married to a rancher who'd nearly lost everything to one. She proposed staggering the construction across 2 building seasons, using ranch labor during the slower winter months to keep costs down, and setting aside a fixed percentage of each quarter's mining income specifically for the school's construction and, later, its ongoing upkeep, rather than drawing on it as one lump sum that might tempt them toward corners cut. Ezra agreed to every particular without argument, having learned by then that when Mercy presented a plan this carefully worked, objecting to it rarely improved on what she had already considered from every angle he might have raised. Construction began in April, on a rise of land near the church that Ezra donated outright rather than lease, and it was Mercy who oversaw the building in practical terms, negotiating lumber prices with Otis Frame at the Mercantile, hiring 2 of the mine's off-season laborers for framing work, and keeping the accounts in a ledger she balanced herself each evening by lamplight, a habit that had begun in girlhood helping her father track survey fees and had never entirely left her. Silas Pratt, now 16 and increasingly capable, took charge of much of the daily labor himself, having grown under Mercy and Ezra's household from an orphaned hired boy into something closer to a son, though no one in the household used that word aloud until considerably later. By midsummer, the schoolhouse stood framed and roofed, a single long room with tall windows Mercy had insisted on for the light, and a small separate room at the back she designated, without asking permission from anyone, as a lending library, stocked at first with only a dozen books but growing, over the following years, into the largest private collection in the county. There were setbacks during construction that tested Mercy's patience without ever quite breaking it. A late April storm tore the partially finished roof clean off one night in early May, undoing 3 weeks of labor in a single hour, and Ezra found her the next morning not weeping over the wreckage, but already sketching a revised framing plan on the back of a feed sack, having concluded overnight that the original design had set the roof pitch too shallow for the county's harsh spring winds. No sense rebuilding the same mistake, she told him, and the second roof, built to her steeper specifications, weathered every storm that followed for the next 30 years without incident. There was, too, a dispute in June with a lumber supplier from the county seat who tried to charge the Coops nearly double the going rate once word spread that silver money was behind the project. A scheme Mercy uncovered by quietly comparing his invoice against prices Otis Frame quoted her for identical stock, and which she resolved by simply taking her business to Frame entirely, a decision that cost the outside supplier a customer and won Frame's mercantile a steady stream of building trade that lasted years beyond the schoolhouse itself. Otis Frame, who had told Mercy so plainly on her first visit to Coyote Bend that she had married into a sinking ship, found himself over that spring and summer becoming something like an ally rather than a mere merchant, drawn in by her fair dealing and by the simple fact that her business was good business, honestly conducted. He extended credit to the school project on terms more generous than he offered most ranchers, telling Mercy once, gruffly, that he had misjudged her that first week and did not intend to make the same mistake twice. A small but genuine reversal that Mercy noted and appreciated without ever making him repeat it aloud a second time. By July, the schoolhouse walls stood finished and whitewashed. The windows Mercy had insisted on for the light fitted with real glass rather than the oiled paper that still covered half the buildings in town, a detail she considered non-negotiable, since she remembered too well straining her own eyes over lessons by poor light as a girl and did not intend the children of Coyote Bend to do the same. Silas built the desks himself that summer, working from a design Mercy sketched based on ones she remembered from a proper schoolroom in Waco. Simple benches with sloped writing surfaces, sturdy enough to outlast a generation of restless children, and by August the building stood essentially complete, waiting only for its official opening and the books Mercy had already begun ordering by post from Fort Worth, and even, for a few precious volumes, as far as St. Louis. The schoolhouse's opening was set for the first Saturday of September, timed deliberately, at Mercy's suggestion, to coincide with the town's annual harvest gathering, an event that drew nearly every family within 20 miles to the church grounds for a shared meal, games for the children, and the settling of whatever small business had accumulated over the summer months. It was, Mercy understood clearly, exactly the kind of gathering that suited what needed settling that year. Not a courtroom, not a duel, but a table long enough for the whole county to sit at, where whatever remained unresolved could be resolved in full view of neighbors rather than behind closed doors. She spent the week beforehand baking alongside 2 other ranch wives, Louisa Kemp and Bettina Frame, who had, over the past year, become something like friends, women who had watched her preserves win quiet respect at the previous autumn's social and had since stopped listening quite so readily to Delphine Ashcroft's commentary. Louisa, in particular, had taken to stopping by the Coop kitchen most Thursdays that year, ostensibly to trade recipes, but really, Mercy suspected, simply for company, and their friendship had grown into the kind of steady, unremarkable closeness that Mercy had not had with another woman since before her mother's death years earlier. The morning of the gathering dawned clear and unseasonably warm for September, and by 10 o'clock wagons had begun arriving from every direction. Families Mercy had come to know by name over 3 years of Sunday services and mercantile visits. Children racing ahead of their parents toward the schoolhouse steps where Mercy stood waiting with a pair of scissors borrowed from Delphine's own millinery to cut a ribbon Louisa had sewn from scraps of blue cloth. A small and unspoken echo, though only Ezra recognized it, of the faded blue shawl still hanging on its peg back at the house. Ezra stood beside her, Rebecca Ann not yet born, but Mercy already carrying her, a fact only Ezra and the midwife yet knew, and when the ribbon fell away and the schoolhouse doors swung open for the first time, the gathered crowd of nearly 60 souls applauded in a way Coyote Bend had not applauded anything since the church bell was first hung a decade before. The reading of the plaque came next, a simple bronze plate Mercy had ordered from Fort Worth, and mounted herself above the schoolhouse door, reading only, "In memory of Rebecca Coop, who first dreamed of this place, and in hope for every child who learns within it." Ezra read it aloud to the assembled crowd himself, his voice steady though his eyes were not entirely dry. And it was in that moment, more than in any private conversation the two of them had shared, that Coyote Bend understood fully what kind of woman Ezra Coop had married. Not a rival to his first wife's memory, but its faithful steward. After the plaque reading, the gathering settled into the ordinary rhythms of a county social. Long tables set with food under the September sun, children released to run the schoolyard's new grounds, while their parents visited in clusters that shifted and reformed throughout the afternoon. Mercy moved among the crowd with a mixture of pride and exhaustion she had not expected, accepting congratulations from families she had come to know across 3 years of Sunday services, and it was in the middle of one such conversation, with Louisa Kemp and 2 other ranch wives discussing the coming winter's provisions, that Harlan Doyle approached her directly for the first time since the previous October's confrontation. The afternoon light had turned gold and long by the time the crowd began its slow dispersal toward evening chores, wagons loading with tired children and empty picnic baskets, and Mercy stood for a moment at the schoolhouse steps watching it all, Ezra beside her, Silas nearby helping an elderly rancher load his wagon, the whole scene arranged before her like something she had built not just with lumber and lending money, but with 3 years of patient, unglamorous work, mended fences, tended gardens, careful ledgers, and the slow accumulation of trust that no single dramatic gesture could have purchased nearly so cheaply. "Quite a thing you built here," Ezra said quietly beside her, and Mercy, watching the last wagons roll toward the road, told him only, "We built it. All of us did, one way or another." A correction she meant fully, understanding by then that no legacy worth having was ever truly built by a single pair of hands alone. Harlan Doyle arrived at the harvest gathering later than most, and Mercy watched him take in the schoolhouse, freshly painted, its windows catching the last gold light of the afternoon, with an expression she could not immediately read. He approached her directly, which he had not done since the day Ezra ordered him off the property the previous October, and said gruffly that Rebecca had spoken of wanting a school built here more than once in the years before her death, and that he had never expected to see it done, least of all by a stranger's hand. Mercy told him, plainly, that she had built it as much for Rebecca's memory as for the children who would fill it, since it was Ezra who had told her of his first wife's wish, and that she hoped Harlan might allow his own children, when he had them, to be among its first pupils. Something in Harlan's face loosened at that, not full forgiveness, not yet, but the first real crack in 2 years of hardened grief, and he told her, before walking off toward the food tables, that he supposed he had judged her too quick and too harsh, and that he was not too proud a man to say so once, if not twice. Cornelius Redd did not attend the gathering, having quietly reduced his standing in Coyote Bend since the previous winter's failed attempt to claim a share of the Coop mine. his reputation among the county's other ranchers having suffered considerably once word spread, through channels Mercy suspected but never confirmed, involved Julius Ferris's own discretion of how close he had come to seizing land through a debt he had allowed to fester deliberately. He sent his resignation from the county bank's board within the year, moving his business dealings to Fort Worth, where his name carried none of the weight it once had in Coyote Bend. And though Mercy felt no triumph in his fall, she noted it the way she noted all things, as a fact settled in its proper place. Delphine Ashcroft's reckoning came more gently, though no less completely. She arrived at the harvest gathering, as she arrived at every county event, expecting an audience for her observations, and found instead that the crowd's attention had turned entirely toward the schoolhouse and toward Mercy, whose quiet competence had, over the preceding year, simply outlasted every rumor Delphine had ever spun about her. Standing near the punch table, Delphine remarked to a neighbor, not quite low enough to escape Mercy's hearing, that she supposed some newcomers turned out better than expected after all, a grudging concession that Mercy chose to accept in the spirit it was almost, though not entirely, intended. Mercy sought Delphine out directly before the afternoon ended, not to extract a fuller apology, which she suspected the woman was constitutionally incapable of giving, but simply to close the matter plainly, in the same way she closed most things. "I heard some of what was said about me this past year, Mrs. Ashcroft," she said, keeping her tone level and without accusation. "I don't imagine we'll ever be close friends, and that's fine, but I'd rather we not carry old suspicion forward into whatever years we've still got as neighbors in this county." Delphine, caught without her usual armor of an audience to perform for, studied Mercy a long moment before answering, and what she said surprised them both a little. "You built that schoolhouse for children who aren't your own blood, Mrs. Coop, and you did it without once asking this town to think better of you for it. I've known plenty of women who'd have made considerably more noise about less." It was not quite an apology, and Mercy did not expect it to become one, but it was, she understood, as close to respect as Delphine Ashcroft knew how to offer, and she accepted it as such, extending her hand, which Delphine, after a brief hesitation, shook. Thaddeus Vane never returned to Coyote Bend. Word reached the town the following spring, by way of a Waco newspaper that made its way west in a mail pouch, that he had married a merchant's widow with a considerably larger fortune than Mercy's family had ever possessed, a match Mercy read of without any feeling beyond mild relief that a chapter she had long considered closed had, at last, closed itself completely on his end as well. Mercy learned somewhat more of that marriage's particulars a few years later, when a distant cousin of her mother's, passing through Coyote Bend on her way to settle in California, stopped to visit and shared what little Waco gossip still reached her, mentioning that Vane's new wife had proven considerably less pliant than he likely expected, holding tight control over the fortune she brought into the marriage, and leaving Vane, by most accounts, in a union built on the same transactional footing he had once tried to impose on Mercy herself, only this time with the balance of power resting firmly on the other side. Mercy found in this news not vindication, exactly, since she had long since stopped measuring her own choices against Vane's fate, but a quiet confirmation of something she had come to believe firmly in the years since, that a man who approached marriage as a negotiation to be won eventually found himself negotiating with someone shrewder than himself, and that she, at least, had chosen a partnership built on entirely different terms. The years that followed the schoolhouse's opening unfolded in the same deliberate, unhurried rhythm that had carried Mercy through her first seasons at the Coop place, each one marked less by drama than by accumulation, a fence mended, a harvest brought in, a child born, a winter survived. By the spring of 1877, 3 years after Mercy first climbed down from that cracked wagon wheel into the mud of Coyote Bend, she and Ezra had a daughter, whom they named Rebecca Ann, a choice Mercy made deliberately and without hesitation, wanting the first wife's name carried forward in love rather than left to gather dust on a shawl no one touched. Ezra wept the first time he heard the name spoken aloud over the cradle. the only time in all the years Mercy knew him that she saw him weep at all, and he told her afterward that it was the truest kindness anyone had shown him since Rebecca's death, greater even than the schoolhouse or the silver both. A second child followed in 1879, a son they named Thomas after Mercy's own father, the surveyor whose careful teachings had, in the end, saved the very ground his daughter came to stand on. Though Thomas Coop grew to favor his father's temperament more than his mother's, quiet and steady with cattle, rather than with rock and water, a fact Mercy noted with amusement rather than disappointment, believing firmly that a family's gifts need not repeat themselves identically to be equally valuable. Ezra taught Thomas the cattle trade from nearly the moment the boy could walk, and by the time Thomas was 10, he could read the health of a herd at a glance the way his mother could read a creek bed, each child, in the end, inheriting a different half of the partnership that had built the ranch they would one day share between them. The winter of 1878 brought the hardest test the young family faced since the mine's discovery, when a diphtheria outbreak swept through the county's children, claiming 11 young lives across 3 neighboring ranches before it ran its course. And it was Mercy, drawing again on knowledge her father had passed to her, though this time concerning water rather than stone, who traced the outbreak's likely source to a shared well 2 ranches had been drawing from that ran too near a hog pen for safety, a connection the county's single overworked doctor had not had time to investigate himself. She could not undo the deaths that had already occurred, and she carried the weight of those she could not save for the rest of her life. But the well was closed within the week of her warning, and no further cases arose among families who heeded it. A quiet contribution to the county's welfare that she never spoke of publicly, and that only Ezra, Dr. Aldous Fenn, and the families directly affected ever fully understood the scope of. Rebecca Ann herself fell ill briefly during that same outbreak, a fever that kept the household in a state of quiet terror for 4 days, before finally breaking. And it was during those 4 days that Mercy first fully understood the particular helplessness that had once driven Ezra's own grief after his first wife's death, sitting through the same kind of long nights he must have sat through years before, watching a fever run its course with no certainty of the outcome. Ezra did not leave the sick room during those 4 days except to see to the most urgent ranch business, and Mercy, exhausted and frightened in equal measure, found herself grateful for his steady, silent presence in a way that went beyond words, understanding that whatever else defined their marriage, this shared capacity to sit through hard nights together without flinching from them was its truest foundation. Rebecca Ann's fever broke on the 5th morning, and both parents wept openly for the first time in front of each other, a release neither had allowed themselves during the crisis itself. Dr. Aldous Fenn, the county's only physician, credited Mercy's warning about the contaminated well with saving considerably more lives than the outbreak ultimately claimed, and he told her so plainly during a visit that spring, suggesting she consider some formal study of medicine or midwifery, given her evident aptitude for tracing illness to its practical cause. Mercy declined the suggestion, telling him honestly that her gift lay in reading ground and water rather than treating the body directly, but she did agree, at his continued urging over the following years, to serve as an informal resource for ranching families uncertain whether a well or creek was safe to draw from, a role she filled quietly for the rest of her life, never charging a cent for the advice and never seeking credit for the harm it prevented. Rebecca Ann and Thomas grew up together in a household that neither of them ever knew as anything but stable, prosperous, and full of the particular warmth that comes from 2 parents who had each, in their own way, built their partnership out of hardship rather than ease, and who therefore never took its steadiness for granted. Mercy made a point, every year on the anniversary of her arrival in Coyote Bend, of telling her children the full story of that first muddy walk from the train station, the cracked wagon wheel, the hen dead of no fox but a washed-out hole beneath a fence post, wanting them to understand plainly that the comfortable life they knew had not always existed, that it had been built, deliberately and by hand, out of far leaner beginnings than they could easily imagine. Thomas, older by 2 years, took naturally to a protective older brother role toward Rebecca Ann despite their different temperaments, and the two remained close throughout their lives, a closeness Mercy privately attributed to the fact that neither child had ever been made to compete for their parents' attention or approval, each valued plainly for the different gifts they brought rather than measured against the other's strengths. Thomas managed the cattle side of the ranch's operations from his early 20s onward, expanding the herd further still through careful breeding practices he developed largely through his own trial and observation, while Rebecca Ann's growing expertise in mineral surveying eventually extended the family's prospecting well beyond the original Northeast claim, identifying two additional smaller deposits on Coop land over the decades that, combined, kept the family comfortably provided for long after the original vein's richest years had passed. The two siblings' complementary strengths became, in later years, something of a local example other ranching families pointed to when raising their own children, proof that a family's prosperity need not rest on a single source of income or a single gifted heir, but could instead be built, deliberately, from the varied strengths of everyone willing to contribute their particular skill to the whole. Mercy took quiet satisfaction in watching this unfold, understanding it as the fullest expression of the partnership she and Ezra had built together from their very first uneasy weeks as strangers under one roof. Not a hierarchy of one partner's gifts over another's, but a genuine combination of different strengths, each necessary, none sufficient alone. The mine on the Northeast 40, managed jointly with Julius Ferris's company under the terms Mercy herself had negotiated, continued to yield steadily rather than spectacularly for the better part of a decade, enough to expand the Coop Ranch's herd back past its old high-water mark of 60 head and well beyond it, to 60 then 80 then, by 1882, upward of 200, making the Coop spread one of the largest and best-managed operations in the county. Mercy oversaw the ranch's books herself throughout, refusing more than once to hand the ledger over to a hired accountant Ezra suggested bringing on, insisting that a woman who could read silver in a creek bed could certainly read a column of figures, and Ezra, who had long since stopped doubting her competence in anything, did not argue the point twice. The ranch's expansion brought its own quiet triumphs across those years, each one small enough on its own, but considerable in accumulation. In 1881, Mercy oversaw the drilling of a proper deep well on the property, freeing the household and the growing herd from dependence on creek water that ran unreliable in dry years, a project she funded and managed herself while Ezra was away 3 weeks that spring on a cattle drive to the railhead at Fort Worth, returning to find the well not only finished, but already tested and approved by the same county assayer who had once confirmed the silver strike. In 1883, she established a modest orchard on the ranch's south slope, apple and peach trees ordered as saplings from a nursery in East Texas, a project that took nearly 6 years to bear meaningful fruit, but which by the 1890s supplied not only the Coop household, but a standing arrangement with Frames Mercantile that put Coop preserves on shelves as far as Fort Worth itself, carrying the same reputation for quality that Mercy's garden produce had first earned her at that harvest social years before. She never stopped reading ground either, treating the habit less as a secret to be managed carefully now than as simply one more skill she brought openly to the family's work. And over the following decade she identified 2 further small mineral deposits on neighboring properties, information she shared freely and without charge with the ranching families who owned that ground, believing, as she often told Rebecca Ann in later years, that a gift withheld out of fear of losing advantage was no true gift at all, and that Coyote Bend's collective prosperity mattered more to her, in the end, than any competitive edge she might have hoarded for the Coop name alone. Silas Pratt, the orphaned hired boy who had once measured Mercy's worth only by whether she fed him properly, grew into a young man of considerable steadiness under the Coop roof, and by 1880, at 19, Ezra formally deeded him a working share of the ranch's cattle operation in recognition of 8 years of labor that had never once been less than faithful. Silas married a Coyote Bend girl, Anna Frame, the mercantile owner's niece, in the same schoolhouse Mercy had built, the building serving by then not only as a place of lessons, but as the town's unofficial gathering hall for weddings, elections, and winter socials alike, exactly the kind of enduring civic heart Mercy had hoped it would become when she first proposed it to Ezra at their kitchen table. Silas's wedding day, in October of 1880, brought its own quiet reckoning for Mercy, since it was the first major community event held in the schoolhouse after its opening, and watching the boy she had taught to read stand at its front, now a grown man with a cattle share and a bride of his own, she understood fully for the first time the shape of what she had actually built, not merely a place of lessons, but a structure sturdy enough to hold every important passage of a community's life. Its weddings and funerals and elections and winter gatherings all folded into the same walls that had once been raised, board by board, out of nothing but her own insistence that Coyote Bend's children deserved better than a 9-mile ride through rising creek water. Silas asked her, before the ceremony began, to stand up with him in place of the mother he had lost so young he could barely remember her face. And Mercy agreed without hesitation, understanding it as perhaps the truest honor Coyote Bend had yet paid her, greater in its way than any public confirmation at a harvest gathering. Silas and Anna went on to have 4 children of their own over the following decade, all of them educated at the very schoolhouse their father had helped build with his own hands. And Silas himself, by 1890, had grown his own small cattle operation, carved from the share Ezra deeded him, into a modest but genuinely independent ranch bordering the Coop property. A man who had arrived at 15 with nothing but the clothes on his back, becoming, within 20 years, a landowner and a father respected in his own right throughout the county, a transformation that Mercy privately considered, when she allowed herself to reflect on it, among the proudest accomplishments of her adult life, more personal even than the schoolhouse or the silver, since Silas had been the first person in Coyote Bend she had ever taught anything at all. Harlan Doyle's reconciliation, begun haltingly at that first harvest gathering, deepened slowly over the following years, rather than resolving all at once, in keeping with the genuine and imperfect nature of real forgiveness. He remained a proud man to the end of his days, never entirely at ease around Mercy in the easy way Ezra or Silas were, but he sent his own children, when they came, to the Coop schoolhouse without hesitation, and in 1885 he was among the first to contribute lumber and labor when Mercy proposed expanding the building to include a second room for the county's growing number of pupils. He never apologized outright for the harshness of his first year's judgment, not in so many words, but he named his youngest daughter Mercy Doyle, a gesture that Ezra told his wife plainly was as close to an apology as Harlan Doyle would ever manage to give, and one that Mercy understood and accepted exactly as it was meant. The specific moment that marked the true turn in Harlan's feeling toward Mercy came not at any public gathering, but privately, in the winter of 1881, when a fever swept through Harlan's own household and left his wife, Susan, gravely ill for the better part of 2 weeks. Mercy rode out unasked the moment she heard, bringing with her the same practical knowledge of illness and nursing that had once helped trace the diphtheria outbreak's source, and she sat with Susan Doyle through 3 of the worst nights of that fever, changing linens and mixing the willow bark tea her own mother had once taught her to prepare, while Harlan, exhausted and frightened in a way his usual gruffness could not disguise, worked the farm alone rather than leave his wife's bedside empty of care. Susan recovered fully by February, and Harlan, walking Mercy to her wagon after the crisis had finally passed, said only gruffly, "Rebecca would have liked you, I think. Took me too long to see it." It was the closest thing to a direct apology he ever offered, delivered in 5 words rather than any longer confession. But Mercy understood by then that with a man like Harlan Doyle, 5 honest words carried the weight other men needed 50 to convey. By the turn of the decade, Coyote Bend itself had grown almost unrecognizable from the single muddy street Mercy had first walked into in 1874. The church finally replaced its cracked bell in 1883, paid for in part by a subscription Mercy organized among the ranch wives, and the mercantile expanded twice under Otis Frame's steady hand, stocking goods that would have seemed impossible luxuries in those first hard years. The Coop schoolhouse, meanwhile, had become simply the school in every local conversation, its origins as a young rancher's wife's private ambition long since folded into the town's shared memory. So thoroughly had it become part of the landscape that newer families arriving in the county assumed it had always been there, the way people assume a well-grown oak has always stood exactly where it stands. The county itself grew alongside Coyote Bend, and by 1888 a rail spur had extended close enough to shorten the cattle drive to market from 3 weeks to 3 days, a development that transformed the economics of ranching across the entire region, and that Ezra, in his more reflective moments, credited in part to the stability the Coop Ranch's recovery had lent the whole county's reputation with outside investors and railroad surveyors alike, since a county with at least one thriving operation was easier to argue for than one entirely at the mercy of drought and debt. Mercy served, by the mid-1880s, on the informal committee of ranch wives who organized the county fair each autumn, an event that grew from the original harvest gathering at the church grounds into a 2-day affair drawing visitors from 3 counties over, featuring livestock judging, quilting competitions, and, at Mercy's particular insistence, a spelling bee held in the schoolhouse for children of every ranching family in the district, regardless of their parents' standing in town, a detail she considered non-negotiable, remembering too well what it had felt like to be judged by circumstance rather than character in her own girlhood. The spelling bee became, over the years, a beloved fixture of the county fair in its own right, and Mercy took particular satisfaction each autumn in watching children from the poorest ranching families in the district compete on entirely equal footing with those from the wealthiest, the contest judged solely on knowledge rather than any advantage of birth or means. In 1887, a girl named Ruth Callahan, whose family scraped by on a small and marginal plot at the county's eastern edge, won the spelling bee outright over children from far more prosperous households, and Mercy, presenting the small prize purse herself, told the assembled crowd only that Ruth's win proved exactly what the schoolhouse had been built to prove from its very first day. That ability recognized no boundary of wealth or standing, and that any child given the chance to learn deserved the full measure of that chance, regardless of what circumstance had handed their family. Ruth Callahan went on, years later, to become the county's second school teacher, training under Rebecca Ann herself before taking over instruction at a newly established second schoolhouse built to serve the county's eastern ranches, a direct and living legacy of the very principle Mercy had insisted upon that first autumn the fair moved its games and judging into the building she had raised. Otis Frame's mercantile, meanwhile, had grown prosperous enough by 1885 to add a second building next door, a proper dry goods store separate from the original grocery and hardware operation, and Frame himself, nearing 60 by then, began gradually handing the daily running of both establishments to his niece Anna and her husband Silas, a succession that kept the mercantile's steady, fair-dealing character alive into the next generation just as surely as the schoolhouse carried Mercy's own principles forward into Coyote Bend's children. Mercy's role in that broader transformation of the county went largely uncredited in any official sense, since she never sought recognition beyond the schoolhouse plaque she had dedicated to Rebecca's memory rather than her own. But those who had watched the county grow across those decades understood plainly that the steady prosperity radiating outward from the Coop Ranch, the fair dealing it modeled, the education it funded, and the practical knowledge it shared freely with neighboring families had done more to shape Coyote Bend's character than any single official body or civic project. Dr. Fenn, in a letter written to a colleague in Fort Worth some years later, described the transformation plainly. noting that a county which had once seemed destined toward the same slow, grinding poverty that claimed so many frontier settlements had instead become, within a single generation, a place families chose to stay and raise children, rather than a place they merely endured until something better came along. A shift he attributed, more than to any other single cause, to the particular example set by one rancher's wife who had arrived with nothing and had spent every year since teaching the whole county, in her own quiet way, that nothing worth having ever came from waiting for circumstance to improve on its own. Cornelius Red's fortunes in Fort Worth, by contrast, never fully recovered from the quiet unraveling that began the winter he tried to claim the Coop mineral rights. Word reached Coyote Bend periodically, carried by traveling merchants or by letters between Julius Ferris and his Fort Worth contacts, that Red had been forced out of 2 subsequent banking ventures for practices similar to the one that had cost him his standing at Coyote Bend, and that he died in 1891, in reduced circumstances, remembered by no one who had known him as anything but a man of narrow ambition who mistook other people's hardship for opportunity. Mercy heard the news without satisfaction and without regret, only the plain acknowledgement that some men spent their whole lives circling the same mistake without ever learning to see it as one. The full account of Red's decline reached Coyote Bend in pieces over the following decade, each fragment confirming the same pattern. His resignation from the county bank's board in early 1875, forced by a quiet consensus among the other board members, once word of the mineral rights scheme spread through channels neither Ferris nor the Coops ever directly controlled, cost him not only his position but the trust of ranching families across 3 counties who had, until then, banked with him out of habit rather than genuine confidence. He moved to Fort Worth that same year, taking a position with a larger banking house that valued his connections more than his character, and was let go within 18 months after a similar pattern emerged there, an attempt to leverage a struggling rancher's debt into an ownership stake in a promising cattle operation, rather than simply collecting what was owed. A third position, at a smaller bank in Dallas, ended the same way in 1883, and by the time of his death 8 years later, Red had spent his final years working as a minor clerk for a firm considerably beneath the standing he had once held in Coyote Bend, a decline Mercy considered. When she heard the full shape of it, less a punishment than simply the slow, inevitable consequence of a man who had never learned that patience spent waiting to exploit someone else's hardship eventually curdles into the very failure it was meant to profit from. Rebecca Ann Coop grew up as much in the schoolhouse her mother had built as in the ranch house where she was born, showing from an early age the same steady, observant temperament that had carried Mercy through her own hardest years, and by the time she was 12 she had taken, unprompted, to accompanying her mother on the same kind of creek-walking expeditions Mercy's own father had once led her on, learning to read soil and stone the way her mother had learned it a generation before. Mercy taught her deliberately, and without her stepfather's old reluctance, believing that knowledge folded away and never spent served no one, and that the surest way to honor what her own father had given her was to give it forward rather than guard it. In 1889, Rebecca Ann herself found a second, smaller vein on a distant corner of the ranch that Ferris's surveyors had missed entirely 15 years before. A discovery that made the local newspaper with the headline, "Second Generation Strikes Coop Silver," though Mercy, reading it at the kitchen table with a private and considerable pride, thought the true strike had never been the silver at all, but the knowledge that had found it passed hand to hand like a family Bible, mother to daughter, the way her own father had once passed it to her. Rebecca Ann's schooling itself became something of a local point of pride, since Mercy insisted her daughter attend classes alongside every other child in the district rather than receive private tutoring at home, a choice some of the wealthier ranching families in the county found unusual once the mine's income made private instruction easily affordable, but which Mercy defended plainly whenever asked, saying she had not built a schoolhouse for every child in Coyote Bend only to keep her own daughter apart from it. Rebecca Ann proved a gifted student under the county's first proper school teacher, a young woman named Prudence Calloway hired from Fort Worth in 1878 specifically to staff the building Mercy had raised. And by 14, Rebecca Ann had outpaced every other pupil in the district in arithmetic and natural science both, subjects Miss Calloway taught with particular enthusiasm. Having been handpicked in part because her own training included geology and mineralogy, a curriculum choice Mercy had specifically requested when the school committee first advertised for a teacher, wanting the practical knowledge her own father had given her available to any child in the county gifted enough to want it, not merely her own. The hiring of Miss Calloway itself had required considerable persistence on Mercy's part, since the school committee's other members initially favored a cheaper candidate with no particular scientific training, arguing that basic letters and arithmetic were sufficient for a ranching community's needs. Mercy argued otherwise at 3 separate committee meetings, insisting that a county whose fortunes had been transformed by careful reading of its own land deserved teachers capable of passing that same practical knowledge forward. And she ultimately agreed to personally cover the difference in salary between the cheaper candidate and Miss Calloway's higher wage for the first 2 years, a private arrangement she never publicized, wanting the decision judged on its educational merit alone rather than on whose money had settled the matter. By 1892, at 19, Rebecca Ann left briefly for a women's college in Austin, the first person in either the Coop or Whitfield family line to receive formal higher education, a fact that filled Ezra with a quiet and considerable pride he rarely spoke of, but which Mercy noticed in the particular care he took corresponding with his daughter by letter every single week she was away, dictating portions to Mercy when his own penmanship, never strong, grew too tired. Rebecca Ann returned to Coyote Bend after 2 years rather than completing the full course, not from any failure, but from a clear-eyed decision, much like her mother's own decisions years before, that the ranch and the mine and the schoolhouse needed her more directly than a diploma would serve her, and she spent the following decades managing the mineral surveying for the ranch's ongoing operations herself, eventually training her own daughter in turn, carrying the same knowledge into a 4th generation that had once seemed destined to end with a dead surveyor in a Waco boarding house. Rebecca Ann married in 1896, at 23, a Coyote Bend rancher's son named Wesley Hartford, who had grown up 2 farms over and had, like nearly everyone in the district, attended the schoolhouse her mother built, and the two raised their own children within sight of the same ranch house where Rebecca Ann herself had grown up, keeping the family's land and its accumulated knowledge close together across generations rather than scattering them, as so often happened, to distant cities and unfamiliar trades. Her eldest daughter, born in 1898 and named Mercy Hartford after her grandmother, grew up hearing the same stories of a cracked wagon wheel and a hole beneath a chicken coop that Mercy had once told her own children, the story passing, by the century's turn, into something closer to family scripture than mere memory, retold at gatherings and holidays with the same careful, unhurried reverence with which it had first been lived. Ezra Coop lived to see his ranch become the largest and most respected operation in the county, and though he remained, to the end of his days, a man of few words and fewer public sentiments, he told Mercy once, in the quiet of their kitchen on the 20th anniversary of her arrival, that he had never once, in 20 years, regretted placing that advertisement in the Fort Worth paper, not even in the leanest months before she came, because whatever hardship had led him to write it had also led, eventually, to everything that mattered most in his life standing in that kitchen with him. Mercy told him in return that she had answered the advertisement expecting only coop duties and a roof, and had found instead a life built stone by stone, the way her father had taught her to read the ground beneath her feet, never rushing to conclusions, always looking for what lay beneath the surface, and trusting that what was solid would, in time, reveal itself plainly to anyone willing to look closely enough. Ezra's health began to fail gradually in his late 50s, a slow decline that neither of them named aloud for the better part of 2 years, though both understood its shape well before either spoke of it directly. He remained active on the ranch far longer than Mercy or Thomas. By then a grown man managing much of the cattle operation himself, thought entirely wise, insisting on riding out with the hands each morning until a fall from his horse in the winter of 1897 finally forced him to accept the limits his body had been signaling for some time. Mercy nursed him through that final illness herself, refusing to hand the task entirely to hired help despite Thomas's insistence that she rest, telling her son plainly that she had built her whole life on tending what needed tending with her own two hands, and she did not intend to stop now, when the thing needing tending was the man who had first trusted her with a wagon load of chickens and a hole in a fence post 23 years before. In his final weeks, Ezra spoke more than he had in years of steady, practical silence, telling Mercy stories from his own boyhood in East Texas she had never heard before, admitting things about his grief over Rebecca's death he had never fully voiced even in their earliest years of marriage, and thanking her, more than once, not for the silver or the schoolhouse or the ranch's prosperity, but simply for staying, for choosing each ordinary day across 23 years to remain at his side when she might, by then, with the mind's wealth fully hers to claim independently, have easily built a different and grander life elsewhere. On one of his final clear afternoons, Ezra asked Thomas to carry him, chair and all, out to the porch step Ezra himself had mended for Mercy that very first summer, wanting to sit in the last of the autumn sun and look out over land that bore almost no resemblance to the ruined estate he had once tended alone in exhausted silence. Mercy sat beside him a long while that afternoon, neither of them speaking much, watching cattle move across pastures that had once run down to 11 starving head, watching the distant roofline of the schoolhouse catch the afternoon light, and Ezra, without turning to look at her, said only, "Best thing that gate hole ever did was bring you walking through it." It was, Mercy thought afterward, the single most romantic sentence Ezra Coop had spoken in 23 years of marriage, and utterly, perfectly, exactly like him to deliver it in the shape of a comment about a chicken coop. Ezra Coop died in March of 1898, at 55, surrounded by Mercy, Thomas, Rebecca Ann, and Silas Pratt, who had asked to be present as though he were truly a son of the household, and the whole of Coyote Bend turned out for his funeral at the church whose bell his wife had helped replace, filling the pews and spilling out onto the grounds in a testament to a life that had, in its final decades, come to mean considerably more to the county than the failing rancher he had been the year Mercy first arrived. That Coyote Bend had not applauded anything since the church bell was first hung a decade before. Widowhood did not slow Mercy in the way some in the county quietly expected it might. She took over full management of the ranch's operations alongside Thomas, who by then had married a neighboring rancher's daughter, Clara Doyle, Harlan's own eldest child, a match that neither family had engineered, but which both received with a quiet satisfaction, since it seemed to close, in the gentlest possible way, whatever distance had remained between the Coop and Doyle households since Harlan's early hostility years before. Mercy lived another 18 years past Ezra's death, remaining in the same house, at the same kitchen table where she had once shown him a stone by lamplight, continuing to balance the ranch's books herself well into her 60s, despite Thomas's periodic and always unsuccessful attempts to convince her to let the younger generation handle the figures. Thomas and Clara's wedding, held in 1899 in the schoolhouse where Clara herself had once been among the first pupils under Miss Calloway's instruction, brought a particular satisfaction to Harlan Doyle that he expressed, characteristically, in only a handful of words, telling Mercy at the reception that he supposed Rebecca would have found it fitting, two families once divided by grief, finding their way, eventually, to the same table. Mercy agreed that Rebecca would have found it fitting indeed, and the two of them, mother-in-law and father-in-law, now bound by their children's marriage, rather than merely neighboring land, shared a rare moment of easy companionship that would have seemed impossible to either of them 25 years before, when Harlan had first ridden onto the Coop property to accuse Ezra of dishonoring his sister's memory. She remained, until nearly the end of her life, the person most families in the county turned to first when a well ran dry unexpectedly, when a strange color appeared in a creek bed, or when a child needed convincing that a hard beginning did not determine a hard end. She served on the schoolhouse's governing committee continuously from its founding until 1910, overseeing its expansion twice more as the county's population grew, and she personally funded, in 1905, a small addition specifically for older students wishing to continue their education past the basic grades, a kind of informal secondary schooling unheard of elsewhere in that part of Texas at the time, staffed in its early years by Rebecca Ann herself, teaching geology and practical land assessment to a new generation of Coyote Bend children, exactly as her mother had once taught her. She took particular pleasure in those later years in the young women who occasionally sought her out specifically, drawn by stories that had, by then, circulated widely enough through the county that Mercy Coop's name had become something of a local legend among girls uncertain of their own prospects. She never turned any of them away, making time even in her busiest seasons to sit with a nervous 17-year-old wondering whether a hasty arrangement or a hard homestead might be survived, telling each of them some version of the same truth she had come to know as certainly as her own name, that a woman's worth was never determined by the circumstances she was handed, only by what she chose to build from them, patiently, one honest season at a time. One such young woman, a rancher's daughter named Josephine Marsh, who came to her in 1908, uncertain whether to accept a marriage her own family pressed upon her, later named her firstborn daughter Mercy, a small echo of the same gesture Silas Pratt and Harlan Doyle had each made in their own way, proof that the particular kind of steady care Mercy Coop offered the world had, by the last years of her life, rippled outward considerably further than the boundaries of her own family, or even her own county. Mercy Coop died in the autumn of 1916, at 64, in the same rope bed she had slept in her very first night at the Coop place. Though it had long since been replaced by a proper frame bed she and Ezra purchased together in their 5th year of marriage. She was buried beside Ezra in the churchyard, and beside them both, at Mercy's own explicit instruction laid out years in advance, a modest headstone for Rebecca Coop, moved from its original solitary plot at Mercy's request, so that the three of them, first wife, second wife, and husband, might rest together the way their memories had come to rest together in the life the household actually lived, without rivalry, each honoring what the other had built. The whole of Coyote Bend turned out again for her funeral, as it had for Ezra's, and Silas Pratt, by then a grandfather himself and the county's most respected rancher after the Coop family itself, delivered the eulogy, telling the gathered mourners that everything solid in Coyote Bend, the school, the well-tended land, the fair and honest dealing that had become the county's reputation across 3 counties over, had grown from a woman who arrived with nothing but $22 sewn into her hem and the patience to look closely at ground everyone else had already decided was worthless. In her last conscious hours, with Rebecca Ann sitting at her bedside in the same small room off the kitchen where she had slept her first uncertain night in Coyote Bend 42 years before, Mercy spoke little, but she asked, at one point, whether the orchard's peach trees had set well that year, and whether the newest crop of schoolchildren were minding Miss Calloway's successor properly. Small, practical questions that Rebecca Ann understood, even in the moment, as her mother's particular way of taking stock of a life fully and deliberately lived, checking the ledger one final time to see that everything she had planted still stood ready to bear fruit long after her own hands could no longer tend it. Rebecca Ann answered each question plainly. The orchard had set heavy that year, the school children were thriving, and Mercy, hearing this, closed her eyes with what her daughter would later describe, to anyone who asked, as the particular expression of a woman entirely at peace with the accounting of her own life. The blue shawl that had hung untouched on its peg by the kitchen door the day Mercy first arrived remained there still, decades later, mended twice over the years by Mercy's own hand rather than replaced, a small and constant tribute to the woman whose wish for a schoolhouse had, in the end, been fulfilled by a stranger who came to love this land and its people as thoroughly as if she had been born to them. In her final years, when younger women in the county came to her, as they sometimes did, asking how a person built a life from circumstances that looked, at the outset, like nothing at all, Mercy would tell them only what she had come to know as plainly true. That ground which looked worthless to an untrained eye might carry an entire fortune beneath its surface, that a house that looked cold and shuttered might, with patience, warm itself around whoever was willing to stay and tend it, and that the truest legacy a person could leave was never the wealth pulled from the earth, but the knowledge and care planted deep enough to outlast the person who first put it there, growing quietly, season after season, long after the hands that planted it had gone still, spreading roots wide beneath the same Texas soil that had once seemed to promise her nothing at all.